Welcome back everyone. In today's video, I'm going to be installing the Stage 1 Plus power kit from Tweetler Performance, and I'm going to be doing before and after road and dyno testing to see what my new peak power numbers are. If you're a new Figure It Outie viewer, hi, my name is Steve. I do a lot of things here on the channel. I encourage you to poke around and take a little look. You can also find me on Instagram anytime at Figure It Outie, and check out the join button below every single video to learn more about the Four Rings Club. So we need a quick recap here of the recent history of the 25 Quattro S4. There's been a number of build series on it. You can all check it out right here. The finale of which from this last fall, which was only about 4 or 5 months ago. We went to the dyno and we finally got our proven dyno numbers of 355 horsepower and 329 foot-pounds of torque. So that's going to be our baseline of power as it sits right now, because absolutely nothing has been changed to this car since that time. And it was through that last series when I was upgrading the intake and the exhaust system that I found the old adage that an engine is just a big air pump to be absolutely correct. Granted, these 4.2 V8s aren't considered to be like a big block. The displacement isn't that big. It still needs to breathe, and every time that you can get more air into it and easily allow it to expel the air is going to be really, really good for power. Which brings me exactly to the purpose of the Stage 1 Plus kit from Tweetler, because I want to draw everything I can out of the current Jackal Stage 1 that I'm running. Now, long term, my goal is to bring the car up to Jackal Stage 3, and of course, that's going to require me to do a couple more modifications along the way, because there are component requirements to switching on the tune for Stage 2 and then for 3. And right now, although I'm on Stage 1, I'm getting close to the peak performance that you can reasonably expect out of Stage 1, but with these final additions from Tweetler, I'm going to be able to push it even further to see truly what you can get out of a Stage 1 Jackal car. So let's go ahead and take a look under the hood here and see why this first part of the Tweetler kit is so important. For this next bit, we'll go back to our air pump analogy and think about the engine trying to breathe through a straw. Now, if your car is stock, your straw currently looks something like air coming through just this little vent right here into a scoop into your stock air box where there's a big panel filter sitting there, and then it moves through some tubing into the same MAF that I currently have right here, and then into sort of like a corrugated plastic thing, through the throttle body, through the elbow, and then finally into the intake manifold. But clearly, my intake setup is not stock. I've been working on making my straw bigger over the last year. I'm running the Jackal Motorsports cold air intake kit, so cone filter, some piping. Again, I do have the stock mass airflow sensor body right here, but I've swapped out the throttle body inlet behind it to this 034 Motorsport job right here. A little wider, silicone, smoother corner, which means if there's a next possible restriction in the intake track, it's right here, the throttle body. Which brings us to part 1 of the 1 Plus Power Kit, this beautifully designed Tweetler 90mm internal diameter throttle body. We'll take a much better look at this side by side with the stock throttle body when it comes out. I'll run you through the basic DIY of how to swap out these throttle bodies in a second, but first we got to do what we do and collect some baseline data. Now, some of the benefits of the 1 Plus Power Kit are not going to be as measurable as I'd sort of want them to be, but just in the sense that they're a part of the driving experience. You know, we still want our cars, as we're modifying them, to be a pleasurable experience to drive. We don't want the car to start acting wildly when we don't expect it to. And when you're going to a larger throttle body, you have to think about that larger amount of air moving through it is going to affect things like how you roll into throttle. Maybe you want to do some shift blipping. Perhaps you are at wide open throttle either at the top of the rev range or maybe just off of a dig. It's going to change the way that driving characteristic works in the car, so we want to feel out what it's going to be like. Like I said, we've already been to the dyno recently, so we have our max power numbers, but what we want to refresh ourselves on is what the graph looks like, because it's easy to get distracted by those peak power numbers, and yeah, we'll be looking at those in my after dyno session too, but we want to keep a close eye on what happens in the graph, because you have a torque curve that kind of looks like a climbing mountain, and then it plateaus and tapers off, whereas the power on the V8 engine anyways kind of goes straight up towards redline, and we want to see where the changes might occur with this 1 Plus Power Kit. For reference, here is my top power run from last year, just the isolated run that we'll compare against later. Keep in mind, we're going back to the same dyno, same shop, same everything. So that leaves us with the mass airflow sensor readings that we can collect right now. Now, I'm not going to get into how a MAF works. I suggest you Google it. Lots of good videos out there. But suffice to say that it's essentially recording voltage and translating that through the ECU into basically a volume over time metric, grams per second. That's what we're going to capture. And I'm going to grab 3 readings. We're going to get 2 at idle, 1 at cold start, 1 at warm idle, and then we're going to grab another one in second gear towards redline at wide open throttle. If you're wondering how I'm going to get those readings, it's going to be through my handy dandy Rostec cable and the VCDS program that comes with it. That's how we're going to do a live logging session of this metric. As I start the car, cold idle registers an average of 10.5 grams per second, and later as the RPM drops into warm idle, it settles to about 7.5. There's some dark looking clouds off to my left hand side, which means a nice spring rainstorm is going to come soon to wash away all this dust and gravel on the streets of Edmonton, which is awesome. So we're just going to go for a quick run here and grab a couple of extra metrics. I've actually added 2 more items I want to keep track of during this drive. In addition to the grams per second from the MAF, I've added engine RPM and also my throttle position. While we take a little drive here to the spot where I usually do some street pulls, I'll just say I love the way the car drives right now. Truly no complaints. Like I said a couple videos ago on the S4 series, leading into that final dyno session, putting the exhaust on the car was really helpful because it got air moving out of the engine really fast, which improved my ability to do downshift throttle blipping. And it feels so good. I feel like whether I'm just like tipping into the throttle on a pull where I'm already moving, or just rolling on and off in normal traffic just like this, I feel like I have a lot of control, but it's also pretty snappy already. In pretty much any gear, just because of the torque with this engine, I can mat it and it responds very quickly. Like way less than a second for it to pick up and start going. Let's give second gear a go. All right, pretty good pull. Let's go check out what that data says. I've created a scaled down RPM number, which is in yellow, so that we can see all 3 metrics in one view. Throttle position in red is wide open at 4,000 RPM and stays that way till 6,700 RPM. Note the delay between the driver inputs and throttle and when the RPM reacts. The peak airflow of 253 grams per second is reached at 6,300 RPM, which is interesting because it peaks before the maximum RPM. This airflow volume is already pretty good, being comparable to B7s with the 2-liter motor when they have upgraded larger turbos. It is time we get to work, get wrenching, and get this throttle body installed. Right off the bat, I'll tell you this might be a choose your own adventure depending on how much time you want to put into this, other maybe maintenance while you're in there, or what your experience is with your car. I'm going to do sort of the lazy version, the smart version, because I've done a bunch of modifications to the car that makes it so that I have a lot of room working back behind the intake manifold there, and I can remove some parts nearby very easily and put them back. You might actually want to take off your entire intake manifold. It might make part of this install easier for you, but while you're doing that, it'll expose the valley pan where there is an important gasket down there that fails, which would be a great piece of maintenance item to do while you're there. And under that is some oil check valves that are even more important, so plan accordingly here. Although I'm not going to show you a DIY of how to remove the intake manifold, I will provide a very useful, probably more useful document in the description of this video anyways. It's from ECS Tuning. It's a PDF that is essentially a walkthrough of how to remove and reinstall the intake manifold, including all the important torque specs that you're going to need to know when you do that. But also know that the One Plus kit from Tweetler already is going to provide you all the gaskets related to putting the intake manifold back on. They're really cool, actually. They're 3D printed. I'll show and talk more about those in a little bit here when it becomes relevant. So you're set no matter what, but please refer to that information instead. Now, I realize most of you watching the DIY are going to have your stock airbox in place and not the Jackal setup that I have. That is totally fine. The Tweetler kit absolutely has been designed to work with your stock system, so that's okay. All you need to really do is take off the rubber elbow that's going to be in this exact same location as my 0341. Once you do that, you'll have access to the 4 5mm headed bolts that are holding the throttle body to the elbow behind it. And now that I have my OE1 on the bench, we can do a little side-by-side comparison. My numbers tell me that the stock throttle body inner diameter is 84 millimeters. Of course, the Tweetler one is 90. And looking at them, you might not think that's a huge difference, but it really is. If you calculate the inner surface area of the circles, a move from 84 to 90 represents roughly a 15% increase in total volume. If you're mostly a bolt-on boy like me, you're going to appreciate the fact that this is totally plug and play. So the factory harness connector for the 6-pin is going to go right into there. No modifications required. If you're already really liking what you see about the throttle body, but you don't have a B7S4, don't worry. This kit's actually available for many other platforms as well. If you have a D2, a C5, a B6S4, or a variety of the A6 and S6 cars, you probably have something for you too. Now, a bit of the secret sauce of this throttle body kit is this completely custom 3D printed adapter that Tweetler made, because of course we need to get from 90mm here, but behind it, we still need to mate up into the intake elbow behind it, which is roughly 85 millimeters. So that was accomplished by this cool bit of kit that has a bit of a taper. You can see the black, backside there is actually a little bit narrower than the outside. And we've got provisions here so that the throttle body can bolt to it. And then on the other side, we can pass through bolts so that this whole thing bolts into the intake elbow. But wait, there's more. When it comes to 3D printed with this kit, these are super cool. Yes, they're gaskets that go on either side of the adapter. But check this out. Look how pliable they are. They're made out of a really cool polymer that make them really heat and chemical resistant. But other than that, they're also reusable, and Tweetler offers a lifetime guarantee on them. Now, you can be honest with me. Have you been reusing your metal gaskets? I'm sure you have. I have too in the past. But technically, because of what they're made out of and that little crinkly bump that exists in them, as soon as you compress them one time, technically they are throwaway after that. They do not retain their sealing ability past that point. And what's so awesome about the Tweetler kit now is that because of the structure that's been 3D printed into it, not only are they reusable and more pliable, but it actually gives you a better seal than a metal gasket anyways. Here's your installation order. So you have this gasket sitting against the elbow in the car, adapter next, make sure that the silver bosses are facing backwards. That is held into place onto the elbow with the little bolts. This gasket, throttle body, long bolts, and the long bolts go into our bronze holes right here. One more quick disclaimer about what you'll see on my car that you may not on yours. So I have completely deleted my coolant lines that go through the elbow. So you will have a line coming in and out of coolant. If you have the JHM kit, they're connected, but you'll have two hoses that are connected together spanning this area. I've deleted mine entirely. So I've actually capped them off down on the main water lines and then one back here against the firewall. So I don't have those whatsoever. And a very minor note, I've changed my PCV system so that my PCV actually faces a different direction and it sits a little further back towards the firewall because I've changed out the hose to send it all backwards a little bit. Super final note here, I'm holding my tap and dies for a 6mm by 1/0 thread pitch. What I usually like to do in a project like this is if there's been a lot of action over time into holes like this here, they're probably gunked up with like thread locker and maybe like sand and stuff like that. I usually just like to go ahead and take something like this and just chase down those threads to make sure that everything is super clean when I do the installation. At times I'll even take my die and I'll put it across the new hardware. You'd be surprised at what type of like little bits of metal from the machining process are left over on there. I just try to make sure everything is super clean. This is a great time to pause. Ooh-wee, look how nice this looks. Obviously the adapter has required the throttle body to be rotated about 90 degrees to make sure that there's room for the big motor to be sticking out the top. It does mean that the engine cover, the plastic cover with the Audi rings on it, that usually sits right here, won't be able to fit anymore, but that's okay because this is a pretty nice piece of tech to show off. I want to call out a couple things though, starting with the electrical plug. Usually it's right about here, but on the new throttle body, your connector is going to be back underneath the motor right there. So what I'm going to do actually is take my heat gun, I'm going to apply a little bit of heat and reshape the memory of sort of the curvature of this part of the loom. I'm going to make it bend around the back, which you're gonna have to do regardless. I just don't wanna risk snapping any wires in here because they can get pretty crusty and hard over time. So I'm just gonna make sure that it's got a new curvature up to the motor. I also wanna talk about the vacuum pipe that's right here. Whether you knew what that was or not, that is your vacuum source for your brake booster. So this travels through a port in your firewall and back to the brake booster, which gives you essentially assisted brakes. Obviously, you're gonna need to reconnect it to this port right here on the suction pump. And clearly this line is going to plug into the little port that pulls air actually from before the throttle body straight into the intake manifold. I believe that's to help idle. Point here being, yes, it's going to have to cross over top of the throttle body motor like that. That is your direct path of connection. My overall point being, don't be afraid to take off those little clamps right there. They're just pinch clamps that you can place with more ear pinch clamps later or worm gear clamps. And there's one down at the bottom of the suction pump as well. If you just need to rearrange things to help you reach, that's really no big problem. For instance, you can loosen up the suction pump, rotate it so that this is now pointing up here. You can break that and make sure that you can get some swivel on your little 90 degree here to meet up with your vacuum pipe. It's no big deal. I'm personally going to make a little modification though to this line because the throttle body looks so cool. I don't want to cover it up. I want it to be completely free to look at in all its glory. So I'm actually just going to remove this pipe and make a modification. Now it just fits into this grommet in the firewall with a couple of ridges, which is not usually that hard to do. I just got one hand to do this. There you go, like so. I'm going to steal this fitting and I'm going to remove this 90 degree fitting and I'll show you what I'm about to do in a second. Behold, perfection. So I went a little bit out of my way to make sure everything looks really, really nice and still works well with the Jackal wall. I'll talk about the modifications I made over here in a second, but first, take a look at that. I love how the throttle body looks when I've done a little bit of rerouting to make sure that none of the lines are on top of it. It becomes a bit of a statement piece in the engine bay. I did entirely delete the brake booster line, like I said. The fitting is still in the grommet. I simply have attached some silicone tubing that I got out of my Vibrant pit pack. Lots of different sizes in here, very handy to have on hand. I'll put the link to the Amazon item into the description of this video if you want to pick one of those up. And I just used the factory double clip so I could actually hold it back into place on one of the PCV hoses down there. And it just kind of comes into the top, into the suction pump, really cleans up this area. The only other notable change was I rerouted this vacuum hose right here. Typically it would run out through the back, all the way around into that solenoid. And there's actually a little plastic bubbly looking vacuum reservoir up in your fender, but I cut a couple of inches off of the tube because I short pathed it under the intake now. And that's why everything looks so clean in here. In the event you do have the Jackal system like I do and the 034 inlet elbow, I did make a couple of changes. I actually sliced off a little wedge to make things line up a little bit better, maybe 18, 20 degrees worth of angle here. I took that away right up at the front where it connects to the throttle body, brought my angle back down towards the Jackal hole, which is in a bit of a different position than where the stock airbox is. And then I also picked up just a regular old 3.5 inch inner diameter, 45 degree silicone tube, chopped it up a little bit, chopped it up, and that allowed me to line up the filter head really, really nicely on this side. The second piece of the kit is just as important as the throttle body, and that is a high pressure fuel filter. If you've done any amount of reading about tunes for the S4 platform before, you'll know that at certain points you do need to make fueling changes in order to make that extra power. And it's true, at stage 3 you do need to change out the injectors on this car to injectors that have a higher flow rate, but up until that point, so during stages 1 through 2, you can absolutely get away with your increased fuel needs with this fuel filter. And just in case you're watching this video and you're already stage 3 and you have already upgraded your fuel injectors, you do not and should not also add this high pressure fuel filter. That is too much for the system. Simply just get the throttle body. You will absolutely benefit from that, but you don't need the whole 1 Plus power kit, just the throttle body. First, let me go get my OEM filter out of the car so that we can do some side-by-side comparisons and show you what makes the Tweetler filter unique and very important. FYI, if you've never pulled out the fuel filter on the car before, it's down here right in front of the rear passenger side wheel, and you have to remove just this little panel here. I wanted to tell you about that because there is a bit of a lip out on the outer edge here, and depending on how you're lifting and holding the car up out of the ground, sometimes they can get caught together. So what I usually like to do is come in with a jack first, just lift up the car, and then take out the hardware, which really only consists of 2 torque screws, this one little 10 mil sort of retaining clip, and then these dreaded push pins. I hate these so much. And you should be able to get it out, and then I'm running up on the quick jacks here, so I have lots of room to work. Now, before you get under there and do anything, I highly recommend you check out this video right here. I actually filmed and released that in the middle of doing this video that you're watching right now. I ran into some major problems with my fuel filter of things that I damaged back in days past, and the chickens came home to roost, and I was forced to fix a whole bunch of stuff. So if you're having any troubles getting the filter out or potential damage around the fittings or the fuel lines, watch that first and just be prepared. Now let's look at the fuel filters. Welcome to Steve's Fuel Filter Emporium, where we have everything including the B6 and early B7 fuel filters with 4 ports, the later B7 with 3, and of course Tweetlers with 3 as well. There are differences that matter here, and on screen what you're looking at is actually some coding. So if you look at both ends of your fuel filter, regardless of which one you have, you are going to notice some things that say in, out, motor, RL, VL, E. Any combination of those things, those equate to the ports and what their function is. Also keep in mind that all the filters right now are facing rear of car to front of car. One commonality is that on the bottom side, on the back, there's always going to be a low port where the fuel comes in from your fuel pump. And of course you always need fuel to get out, so on the 3 ports it's always the single one on the right hand side, and on the 4 it's the bottom one. This is where we start differing though. On the 4 port, your return is going to be on the back side, but not where the regulator is. Whereas on the 3 ports, your return comes through the regulator. On the 4 port, this bonus line here, which does happen to come through the regulator in this case, is actually a vent line. And that is this vent line right here. So what's nice is that if you're running an old 4 port like I am, the newer ones actually don't have that at all, which means you get to delete this hose entirely, which is great because who needs extra clutter? Now the first question is going to be, well, what about the top side of that? Where did that go? What do we do with that? Easy solution, which is in your back seat. And keep in mind, you only have to do this if you have a 4-port like I do. Pop up your bench, as simple as putting in your hand here and lifting up the seat out of the 2 clips that are kind of right there. And you'll find your fuel pump side. And on the top side of that pump, you've got your feed line, which I have replaced entirely in that other video. And the vent would have attached right here. Tweetler provides a little cap that fits perfectly on that port. You'll just plug it forever, and that's it. The critical difference, though, is the writing at the bottom. The OE filters are pressure regulated to 4.0 bar, which represents about 58 psi of fuel pressure, whereas the Tweetler filter is regulated to 6.6 bar, which is 96 psi. It's been quite some time since I was sitting in a high school physics class, but I do remember some of the basics of fluid dynamics, and it's what makes this higher pressure fuel filter work to achieve more flow up into the injectors. Now, you probably have noticed at this point that the exit ports that send fuel up to the motor are all the same size in all these filters. They're 5/16. So how are we getting more fuel? Well, it's simply that if there's more pressure behind it inside of the fuel filter coming from the fuel pump in the same amount of space, that will equal greater flow. You are moving more fluid through that port. What you're looking at here is my fuel rail from the S8. So during this generation, although it was still almost the identical V8 to the S4s that we have, what is different is up on the fuel rail, there was actually an inline pressure regulator. That is not the case anymore on the B6, B7 platform. However, the function of that bump and this right here is identical. And I want to show you what this is because it's important to understand how the return line works too. So I'm going to very much generalize what this is, but let's just say there's a diaphragm in here and it's set to whatever that bar or PSI pressure is. And if the pressure inside of the line that's passing through it is any greater than that amount, then it sends the excess away, which is actually through this port in this case. But in our fuel filters, that's the line that's coming out of the regulator on the backside. The new filter is very obviously a smaller diameter than the OE ones. And of course, Tweetler thought of that and included, once again, a pretty cool little 3D printed piece that simply slides on the outside of the filter and then will snug up nice and tight against the OE bracket that's underneath the car. Quite literally breaking news in the middle of this video. Reedco, the owner of Tweetler Performance, just announced that they're actually closing the doors for Tweetler. Maybe not indefinitely, but for the foreseeable future, which means as of this moment when you're watching the video, you actually cannot buy the OnePlus kit that I've been talking about for a little while now. That's okay. I'm going to keep going with the rest of this video as I always plan to because I just want to show you what the results are of this kit. But if you are one of the very few people out there who would have purchased this already or have one of the big throttle bodies, obviously you can use part of this video to help you with your install. But for now, these are now officially rarefied legacy parts. So I'm going to keep going and thank you very much to Reed and everyone else at the Tweetler family. Obviously, it's amazing that they invested, time and their lives into developing a bunch of new products in a really innovative way for platforms that needed some support. And I think as a community, we really welcome them to do that because it was awesome having more investment into these chassis. It's great. So thank you very much. Best of luck to you guys in the future. On with the show. The very last part of this install is actually just the software. So I've got my Jackal tuning suite fired up. Of course, I've got my flashing cable on hand too. And what I'll do is simply stick it into the OBD2 port, fire up the program, and I'll give you a little look in a second of what that's like if you've never seen it before, but it's super easy to do. That's obviously the huge benefit of having your own Jackal flashing cable, because for example, I'm on stage 1 right now. I need to go to the stage 1 plus tune, and it's only going to take me about 10 minutes. I'm going to do it myself, and it's totally free. This is really the money shot of the software right here, your whole list of tunes that are available to you once Jackal sets you up inside of the program with your VIN. So obviously I'll be doing the OnePlus tune today, but as my modification journey continues with the S4, maybe one day I'll make it towards the bottom of the list. It's also kind of cool because there's always a last updated note on each of the files. So even if you are already on, let's say stage 1, for example, sometimes Tony's in there fiddling around and making tunes better for some of the platforms. And you might want to come and check back and see if there's an update. I have done that before in stage 1, and it's always nice to see that they are constantly being worked on. So anyways, I'll go through this one right here. I'll skip the rest. It only takes a couple of minutes. It's a quick couple-week jump forward in time now. I wanted to get some time on this car with the tune in place to give you another in-car review and talk about what it feels like. But honestly, it's kind of uneventful. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because honestly, the biggest risk to putting a large throttle body on your car is that you lose your daily drivability, because the throttle is so big and the amount of air that's moving through a larger sort of flap right there is that you lose that control. It turns into a bit of an on and off switch where you only mean to roll into throttle a little bit, but it's actually sort of like jarring and the car becomes a little bit twitchy. That has not been the case at all, which is fantastic. I did do a throttle body adaptation again through VCDS, which is a very simple process. You can see it in this old video right here if you want to try it out. You don't really actually even need to do that because the car automatically does it by itself pretty often. But really, the drivability feels fantastic. And the butt dyno, who knows how reliable that is. It certainly sounds better in the intake track, I can say that. Is there maybe a little bit more torque? I don't know, it could be a placebo effect. I can add one little piece of data though at this point, which is I did another log run through VCDS with the car, exact same metrics as before. And in that middle of the 6,000-ish RPM range there, which is where it seems like we're moving the most amount of air, we got an extra 2 grams per second. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but it is encouraging, because it does mean that this setup does in fact move more air, which is mostly our goal here with the extra fuel. So we'll see pretty soon what that translates into power. Now, just reflecting a little bit on what we've seen so far, we have two things. We have just a little bit more air, but we have a lot more fuel. And that kind of doesn't really work together, because remember the stoic efficiency ratio, it's about 14:1, which means we need quite a bit more air to burn a little bit more fuel. So what I'm guessing, because again, I don't pretend to understand what's different in the tuning itself between stage 1 and 1 plus, I'm guessing that to compensate for the crazy high fuel pressure in the rails now, they've actually turned down the injector pulses. So it's actually spraying just like a little bit more fuel than it did before. It's not taps wide open kind of thing, because we, again, can't make use of it. So we will see. And here we are back at the dyno at Mr. Matt Lee's shop. And there's just a couple of things I want to address, because of course the perfect way to do this test would have been to do exact same day before and after, but the practicalities are that, you know, in 15-20 minutes it's not really reasonable for me to get into the car, change the fuel filter, put the throttle body on, do the tune flash, and you know, you pay for dyno time, so I'm not just gonna stand there and attempt to do that project live on the spot. But, you know, the downside is theoretically that would have been the perfect way to test it. Like, you know, same air temperature, air density that day, dyno configuration, like the whole 9 yards. It would have been great to do that. But again, I just don't want to put myself in the position where something goes wrong and we would just waste a whole bunch of time. So all that being the case, today is a little warm out here in Edmonton. I'd probably say it's like just shy of 30 degrees, but there is a big cooler up front. So I'd say the air temps coming into the engine at least are going to be like maybe around 20 degrees, something like that. I'm not going to measure it, like it's not quite even worth like trying to do that. The car's warm already. So I'm not really going into this with any huge expectations. Keep in mind, last time we put down like 355. That's sort of a ballpark number, but that was a really nice cool day. So today, in my mind, we might stand to gain maybe 10-15 horsepower off the 1 Plus kit, but it's warmer. So this is kind of a good example of if you've been driving around for a couple hours on the streets and you do like a highway pull or a freeway pull or something like that, your car has already been heat soaked. So this is kind of a great example of maybe like a worst case scenario where the car is warm, how much power can it make? So let's find out. As is typical when Matt's running the dyno, first we do back-to-back third gear pulls to confirm the car is in good health and the dyno is reading output consistently. Here's pull number 1. Which nets 316 horsepower and 311 torque. This may seem a little low, but that's mainly the effect of running in third gear. And on we go to run number 2. Which renders essentially the same results, but we can see the torque has already dropped off ever so slightly. Also note that we ran the car up to 7,000 RPM. Truth be told, there was an additional first pull in fourth gear, but a recording error prevented us from seeing the proper results. So this final pull became the official new fourth gear baseline. That last pull is now the blue line. As we already learned last year, there's a notable difference in the accuracy of power output by the dyno when a pull is made in a gear as close to a 1-to-1 gear ratio as the transmission can offer, which for the S4 and many other 6-speed cars is 4th gear. That's to say, a car doesn't make less power in other gears, it just means calculations a dyno makes to determine its outputs is more accurate running in a gear that most closely matches the speed of the engine. And our results for the day, peak horsepower was 334 and 322 torque. Here's the most significant comparison, my best 4th gear run from the fall of last year in red versus the final run today in green. So let's acknowledge the elephant in the room here. Yes, today we made less power than previous, but let's look at some other details first before we begin speculation. Focusing first on horsepower, look at where the peak horsepower numbers are made. People often say naturally aspirated engines make all their power up top, which is true in general terms because clearly we're looking at a line that goes up and to the right, but look at the point of inflection. Even though we ran the engine past 7,000 RPM this year, there was no additional power to be found. In fact, we see in both tests that peak power occurs at roughly 65 to 6,800 RPM. Remember our MAF logging chart? This is exactly when the engine is taking in the maximum volume of air, proving once again that airflow is everything for these V8s. What's also interesting is that we see both power metrics recover slightly sooner from power loss, which occurs at the moments before the flap inside the intake manifold drops into high RPM position. One might conclude that the tune has updated the flap to change over a few hundred RPM sooner than previous. I do have some final thoughts, and right off the bat I'll say it's still very validating to see that we're making good, consistent power, given in the past we just weren't sure how healthy the engine was. Obviously we've fully debunked that at this point because the car with its very modest stage 1 mods is making exactly what it really should. And that really is saying something because we're making what the advertised crank horsepower is at the wheels of an all-wheel drive system. And the controversial bit of this video, of course, is do I actually think the 1 Plus kit and tune makes less power than the stage 1 configuration that I was already on? No, the answer is definitely no. I do believe it makes more power. I have the absolute faith in the Jackal tuning that if there was more power to make out of that extra air and fuel, they would have found it and done it. I'm all but certain the ongoing limitation is the airflow in the intake track based on the MAF readings that we found, but also the simple fact that removing restrictions is only as good as you can do it all the way from filter to cylinder. The larger throttle body will have a huge impact for those who also have a ported elbow and intake manifold, but until I get those for myself, I'm still just fighting physics on the way down the intake path. And Tweetler's site more or less confirms as much, saying that the throttle body does have even larger impacts for those on stage 2 and 3. Plus the extra power that I know we did make was actually just negated the one day on the dyno because of that ambient air temperature and the corresponding heat soak that had been sitting in the engine for a couple of hours, which to be fair is a very normal and expected result of heat. The fact this time I was only off by 20 horsepower and 7 foot-pounds of torque is actually quite impressive given how much heat soak can actually remove performance. I'm really grateful for this project because it's actually given me headroom to grow in 2 critical areas, obviously fuel and air. For fueling, people usually only make that jump when they're headed into stage 3 because they have to put on larger injectors, but I actually have extra headroom now as I move into stage 2. But more importantly, I would say, is the airflow limitations. I know a lot of people right off the rip can go and grab a ported intake elbow and manifold, and that's fine and dandy, but you'll never have solved the upstream issues that I already have, and namely the throttle body. And truth be told, there isn't another company that really offers a product like this. You need to get the throttle body from Tweetler if you're going to max out your potential. If you're watching this video as it has just come out in July of 2024, it's actually not too late. If you're already sold and you know that you need one of these, go to Tweetler's website right now because they're still winding down operations and they still have select throttle bodies in stock for certain chassis that I mentioned earlier in the video. So go, literally, right now and buy it. And I know I wasn't able to come back with dyno figures to boast what improvements that can be specifically expected here, but truthfully, I think that if you've watched this far into the video and heard me talk about how the intake works and the MAF readings, and you're just thinking about it logically, you know that if you're trying to get all the airflow to this motor, if you don't get one of these now while they're still available, you will always have that little bit of a necked down flow in the throttle body because you simply didn't take the opportunity to get a product that still exists on the market right now to solve that problem. That opportunity is going to go away. Well, my friends, I think I can officially say I've reached the pinnacle of what stage 1 can be on this chassis. I can't wait to see what happens when I go to stage 2, especially because I've done some mods that maybe not everyone would have already had moving into stage 2. So I'm really excited to see what kind of power outputs happen there. And you know what's funny? If you noticed it a couple of shots ago, I've already been messing around with the intake. This is not the same it was at the beginning of the video, but that's going to be for the next one. So stay tuned. As always, like, subscribe, and I really hope to see you next time. Thanks.